I'm Nancy Anderson, and I'm here to talk about Arthur Driscoll. He had 21 grandchildren, and I'm one of those grandchildren, and we're all getting older, and so I thought it was time to pass on some of the stories that those of us who knew him are familiar with, but we don't want those to get lost. So here is a little family tree with Arthur and his wife Ethel at the top. He had 4 daughters, and I'm one of the granddaughters from his oldest child, Marjorie Driscoll. And let me tell you where I'm getting the information from that's included in this presentation. 2 of my sisters, Mary Tucker and Kathleen Little Page, when they were in their late 20s and early 30s, they interviewed his wife, Ethel, who at that time was 89 years old. So she was towards the end of her life. And they interviewed her for hours, and they ended up producing, this is a transcript of it, it's 200 pages double spaced. So they interviewed her over multiple days, and she was quite forthcoming, as you'll see. And then next, let me see how this is looking. Next, my cousin Janice took that information, and based on all of the names and the dates that Ethel talked about in that interview, she was able to come up with detailed genealogy investigation, and she produced this document, which has an enormous amount of detail on our family history and when people came to the United States in lots of different details. She also got lots of great photographs. Then the next one is, that I interviewed Ethel, his second oldest daughter, when she was in her early 90s. And that interview is about 50 pages long. So we have some quotes from his daughter, Ethel. It's a little confusing since both his wife and his second daughter were named Ethel, and those are the 2 people we have quotes from. So I'm going to call his daughter Aunt E, because that's what we refer to her as. And when it's a quote from his wife, I'll call it Ethel. And the last one was that his youngest daughter, Susan, kept all of the papers from his lake house, and she made copies of them. This is double-paged, every letter, every document associated with that for decades. And she copied it and gave us all a copy of that document. So we have that. So there's really an enormous amount of information, as well as now there's information on the internet that wasn't available before. So this has all of those. So, but let's start with his father, because his father, Arthur's father, Dennis, came over from Ireland, and he came over in 1861, which is the first year of the Civil War, the American Civil War. So at that time, Ireland was just finished with the potato famine. The economy was a mess. There were no jobs. He was in his teens, and there were no opportunities for him. So like many, many other young Irish people, he immigrated to the United States. And remember that in those days, there were no telephones. So when you were leaving your home country, you knew that you would never see or even speak to your parents, your siblings, your relatives, your neighbors, your friends, your teachers ever again in your life. So it was an enormous decision to make that kind of entry. But at that time, also, it was anyone who came to the United States, if you could pass a minor physical, you could enter. There was no visa requirement or anything. And he came in through Boston. Several years later, 2 of his siblings also immigrated to the United States. They were also teenagers. But as often happens in those days, people die young, and his youngest sister, Margaret, passed away shortly after she arrived here. So that left him and his sister, Nellie. And as you'll see, it has an enormous impact on Arthur, and as a result on all of his offspring, that Nellie was part of his life. because she had a son who could not have possibly had more influence over Arthur, and we'll discuss that in more detail. But also I just want to say that these two people who came over as teenagers with nothing, built these strong families. They stayed close to them their entire lives. They lived within blocks of each other most of their lives. They both had large families that were very strong and very connected, and they made the most of the fact that they had each other, even though they didn't have many of their other relatives. In fact, they were so close that when they were buried, and by the way, Dennis lived to be 77, which was quite old in that day, and his sister Nellie also lived quite old for that age, and they were actually buried beneath the same headstone with Dennis and his family on one side and Nellie and her husband on the other side. So when they immigrated, they came to Boston, and then they came into this little town called North Brookfield, which was just 50 miles west of Boston. And it was a town in those days, of course, no cars yet. It was mostly pedestrian, some horses. And it was a highly Irish, had a lot of Irish immigrants. In fact, the street that they lived on was almost all Irish immigrants. And the main economy of the town was a boot and shoe factory. Until that point in time, boots and shoes were mostly made for a specific person. So these itinerant cobblers would travel around from town to town and ask who needed boots or who needed shoes. So the idea of making them in mass when you didn't even know who the boots were for was a new one. And that was in North Brookfield, they had one of the largest in the world. And that was where 90% of the economy of the town was. And by the way, North Brookfield today in 2025 is actually slightly smaller than it was in the 1800s when Dennis arrived as a teenager. So Dennis married Mary Connolly, who was another Irish immigrant. She also came over in her teens, and Mary had been married before. She had married yet another Irish immigrant, and he worked for the railroad, but he had an accident and died of tetanus 3 months after they were married. So she became a widow at 19 years old. And when she married Dennis, our ancestor, he was 24 and she was 22 years old. And so they both had immigrated as teenagers from Ireland. Let's talk for a minute about education. Arthur's father, Dennis, was illiterate until he was 35 years old, and he probably only learned to read and write at that point in time because his children were in school. And all of Arthur's brothers had to drop out of school in the 8th grade, as well as one of his sisters. And Arthur and one other sister finished high school, and of course Arthur went beyond that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is one of the first ways in which being the youngest was a huge advantage to Arthur, that he wasn't under pressure to go out and help support the family. This was a new, young, struggling immigrant family, and they probably needed all the income that they could get to help them get by. But by the time that Arthur came along, there were enough people who were working all at the boot and shoe factory that Arthur had options. So this is where he went to high school. He was in a graduating class of just 14 students. This is a picture of him. He graduated in 1902 with, as I said, 14 other students. And by the way, at that point in time, the number of people in the U.S. over 18 who had graduated from the high school was 6%. 6%. And today it's over 90%. So he was already in a group of very educated people just by having completed high school. And in terms of career, all of his brothers, as well as his father, all worked at the boot and shoe factory. And as I mentioned, it was 90% of the economy in North Brookfield, and that's where all the boys and men were expected to work. Now, his two sisters were seamstresses and brought tailoring into their home for their entire careers. That was their career. So as you can imagine, that when Arthur was looking around and seeing his siblings in the boot factory, that he thought that staying in school probably sounded like a pretty good option. So we're going to talk now about a little bit about his cousin Dennis, because as I mentioned, he had such an enormous impact on Arthur's life. So at the top in blue are the two siblings who came over from Ireland as teenagers. And so since they're siblings, of course, all of their children are cousins. So Arthur was the youngest of the 6 children of Dennis's, and then his sister had 7 children. She actually had 3 others who died before the age of 3, which so often happened at that point in time. But his cousin, who was also named Dennis, it's confusing because they seem to use names redundantly all the time, but his cousin Dennis was 7 years older than him. And so he saw his cousin go on and get an education. And that was the first major way in which his cousin influenced him. So I'm going to take a bit of a tangent now and talk about his cousin, because I'm going to go through all the different ways that he influenced Arthur's life. And so it's a little important to see what kind of person he was. So this is a picture of him, and from his college yearbook. So he went to Brown University. So Arthur would have seen him going to Brown, and that clearly had an impact on him, because in fact, that's where Arthur ended up going to college as well. He went to Brown. So Dennis, if you look in the box that is in a red dotted line up here, those are all of the activities that Dennis was in when he was in college. So he was very active. As you can see, not only was he in a lot of organizations, but he was the team leader or the captain of many of the different teams that he was in. And the one club, which is pronounced, I guess, Cimmerian Club, as you can see down here on the bottom, is a club that you had to be elected to in your junior year. There were only a small number of people elected to it, and it was based on your leadership, your integrity, your personal skills. And so clearly Dennis was a leader and a pretty outstanding person when he was in college, and certainly his life beyond that demonstrated those traits as well. This is a picture of, again, Dennis from the yearbook, and again when he was about 60 years old. And I want to read something that Ethel said to him. He was actually Ethel's uncle by marriage, and so she called him Uncle Denny. And she said, he was handsome and charming. Uncle Denny is the kind of man who could talk to me with as much interest as he would talk to George Cohan. Uncle Denny had that gift. No matter what age or sex you were, you felt warm just being with him and talking to him. He was a charming person. So Arthur followed Dennis to Brown. This is the only picture we have of them at Brown. And we're not sure what this picture is all about. It looks like they're hamming it up or something. But here on this, so Arthur's the one in the middle. And the one on this side in the plaid blanket is his friend George Corcoran, who he was assigned to live with his freshman year. And so they wrote to each other to arrange for George to come pick him up at the train station. And Arthur said that he would notice him because he would be the redhead on the platform. Well, it turned out they hit it off famously. They lived together all 4 years at Brown. And they both went to graduate school at Harvard, and they lived together another 3 years at Harvard. So they lived together a total of 7 years. And as you probably know by now, they also, once they were adults and established, bought summer houses together and spent most summers together for the rest of their lives. And this was clearly one of the most significant relationships of Arthur's life. So Arthur just loved Brown. He loved everything about it. And his daughter, Aunt E, said that he went to every reunion he had the opportunity to go to because he just enjoyed Brown so much. And apparently his only disappointment was that he didn't get to play football. And it's because he had to work so hard to support himself. So he started out as a busboy at a nice resort and worked himself up to head waiter, but apparently spent the majority of his time supporting himself and putting himself through school. His senior year at Brown, his mother, who was 60 years old at the time, died of thrombosis. So that was a sad time for the family, obviously. So this is a picture of Arthur, the one on the bottom. I believe it's in the bottom, yes. And as you can see, he has very few activities listed compared to his cousin Dennis. And again, that's because he spent most of his time working and was not able to be as active on campus as he would have enjoyed being. This is the one picture that we have when they're young of Arthur, who is standing, and of his lifelong friend George beside him. So they went to Harvard together. George was in medical school and became a doctor, and Arthur became an attorney. And again, this is the second way in which his cousin Dennis influenced him so much, because his cousin went to law school and became an attorney as well. So this really put Arthur on a path which was very, very divergent from his brothers. And it appears to be at the example of his cousin Dennis. Oh, and his last year at Harvard, his oldest brother passed away at the age of 32. So now we're going to take another little tangent and talk about George M. Cohan. And again, it's confusing because two of the big players in his life are both named George. One is his friend who he lived with for 7 years and was lifelong friends with, and that was George Corcoran. And so I'll try to refer to him as Friend George. And George M. Cohan was the entertainer that had a big impact on the career of both Dennis and of Arthur. So we're going to talk about him for a minute. So the way that they met, so these are the cousins, right? So George M. Cohan was a really close friend of Arthur's cousin Dennis growing up. And he had a vaudeville act that was called the Four Cohans. And by the way, Cohan spelled this way is an Irish name. If it's spelled with an E, then it's a Jewish name. But they were Irish immigrants, and it was with his parents and his sister. And the four of them traveled around the country 9 months out of the year and performed, because at the time, all performances were live. There were no recordings at all. And so this was typical of a vaudeville act. So now I'm going to play you a video that was on the internet, that I found on the internet. And the version I found was 10 minutes long. I edited it down to 4 minutes, so it's a little bit choppy. But it explains to you some things about George M. Cohan and exactly who he is. So listen for the names Arthur Driscoll and Dennis O'Brien. And here it is.
In the 1980s, the small central Massachusetts village of North Brookfield was a thriving community. Centered around the firm of E&AH Batchelor, once the largest boot manufacturer in the world. It was into this world that a young George M. Cohan spent some of his most formative years. As a member of the Four Cohans, George had spent most of his life traveling the country from vaudeville theater to vaudeville theater. The life of a traveling performer was hard, and especially hard on a family of 4. Although born in Providence, Rhode Island, he spent little time there. The family would travel for 40 weeks out of the year. In December of 1878, at the age of 6 months, George made his first visit to North Brookfield. He would return year after year until about the age of 12, with the last visit of his youth occurring in 1895 at the age of 17. His childhood in town was, by his own accounts, filled with fantastic experiences. Baseball was his favorite sport, and he was part of a group of ball players called the Coughlin Disturbers. Cohan served as captain, manager, and coach. It wasn't only baseball and mischief. Little George wrote and produced his own plays in the barn of his grandmother's house on Bell Street. He acted as playwright, composer, and actor. All roles he would grow to excel at as an adult. George was a natural performer. By the age of 9, he played the violin for an audience in Haverstraw, New York. The Coughlin Disturbers became a group of friends that would make lifelong connections. One of George's closest friends, Dennis Cap O'Brien, was a teammate and confidant. Cohan referred to O'Brien as one of the smartest kids he knew, and O'Brien proved him right. Attending Brown University in Georgetown School of Law, the former Coughlin Disturber opened a law office in Providence, Rhode Island. O'Brien had been in the business only a few years when his old friend George M. stopped by. O'Brien explained that he wasn't getting along with his partner, and Cohan made him an offer that would change his life. "Cap, you come down to New York and I'll let you put the biggest picture of me in your lobby that you want. You can let the whole world know that you represent George M. Cohan." O'Brien agreed, and in 1906 moved his offices to New York City. He took his nephew, Arthur Driscoll, in as a partner, and later another North Brookfield boy, Edward Rafferty. The firm of these 3 North Brookfield boys became one of the most powerful law firms in the entertainment industry. O'Brien, Driscoll, and Rafferty represented Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Arthur Godfrey, Walter Winchell, Irving Berlin, Jack Dempsey, and, of course, George M. Cohan. The firm was instrumental in the organization of United Artists, and former North Brookfield resident Ed Rafferty served as its president from 1941 to 1947. Not only had Rafferty served as president of United Artists, he also handled the incorporation of the Pepsi-Cola Corporation. All of this from the former boys of the Coughlin Disturbers. In 1907, Cohan had left the world of vaudeville for writing, producing, and sometimes starring in legitimate Broadway shows. 50 Miles from Boston was another attempt to break free of what he considered the drudgery of vaudeville. He set the show in North Brookfield and includes the names that were familiar to everyone. Names like Brainerd and Woodis, and even had a set built to resemble the general store located in town. 50 Miles from Boston ran a standard run on Broadway with a total of 40 performances. However, as Cohan's shows gained in popularity, it was revived several years later and toured the country extensively.
For I'm just as proud of my name, you see, as an emperor, czar, or a king could be. Who is the man, helps the man every time he can. Harrigan, that's me.
The critics praised the song Small Town Gal, but the tune that stood the test of time was Harrigan, a song that became a part of American popular culture. Over the years, the song has been recorded by hundreds of artists and has been heard on radio shows, movies, and television shows. Cohan went on to become the man who owned Broadway and became one of the most honored American entertainers. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for the songs Over There and You're a Grand Old Flag, and he was personally involved in over 50 Broadway plays and published 1,500 songs.
In spite of the fact that George M. Cohan was one of the most predominant entertainers of his time, he only had a second-grade education. Because of the fact that he was traveling around performing 9 months out of the year, he never had the opportunity to go to school beyond the second grade. So as you can imagine, he was dealing with a lot of money, signing big contracts, and it must have made him feel really comfortable to have an attorney representing him who he had known since childhood and who he completely trusted, and who, as he referred to in the video, thought of as one of the smartest people that he knew. If you go to Times Square today, there is still a statue of George M. Cohan there, which shows that he's still recognized as being a preeminent entertainer of his time. So with that background, let's talk now about Arthur's career. And because the law firm was formed based on the relationship with George M. Cohan. So it started with Dennis. So again, big impact that Dennis had on Arthur. And through his relationship with George M. Cohan, he invited Arthur into the partnership. And then he invited his two nephews into the partnership. And they became the law firm of O'Brien, Driscoll, and Rafferty, which was where all of them spent their entire career. So Arthur spent every day of his career in this law firm. So his cousin Dennis influenced him to go to college, to Brown, then to go to law school and become a lawyer. And then he invited him into this law firm and basically handed him a career, which was just a fabulous career for Arthur. We don't have much information on the personalities of these different people in the story, but we do happen to have one small thing on Ed Rafferty, Dennis O'Brien's nephew, who is in the law firms. This came from his obituary, so I thought I would read it. Rafferty was described as a very jovial, kindly man who never had a harsh word to say about anyone, and a man of exceptionally good memory, who, unlike most lawyers, rarely referred to papers in the course of a trial. We're going to start by focusing on Arthur's career before we move on to other aspects of his life. Arthur was just 42 years old the first time that he argued in front of the Supreme Court. And he argued in front of the Supreme Court a total of 9 different times. And we learned that the transcripts of Supreme Court cases are actually available on Amazon for purchase. And so you can see here the first of his 9 different court cases in the Supreme Court. And here he was representing United Artists, and under it in the blue, you see his name, often with somebody else's name. So this was the first one. Here's the second one. He was representing Douglas Fairbanks, who was quite a well-known entertainer at the time. Here he was representing Metro-Goldwyn Pictures. You can always see in the blue writing below the title of the case, you can see his name down there. Fourth, fifth case, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth. And I found this little article, which I only read because I thought it was fun that they got to do this. He was the mayor of Scarsdale at the time, and this little article in the local paper said, Mayor Arthur Driscoll and Mrs. Driscoll and their 3 of their daughters, the Mrs. Marjorie, Kathleen, and Susan, have been in Washington this week, where Mayor Driscoll is to appear as attorney in a Supreme Court case. And I thought, how fun would that be to have your family actually be able to come and watch you do your job? Not many of us have those kinds of jobs. During this particular visit to the Supreme Court, his youngest daughter, Susan, was 12 years old, and his oldest daughter was 20. I'm including this just because it's unusual. It's a cartoon strip that appeared in a local paper, and apparently they needed an attorney. So in the first frame here, it says, hello, this is your lawyer, Mr. Driscoll. My mother kept it in her photo album for her entire life, and I just thought it was so unique to have something like this. Not many people's career will put them in that position. Arthur's law firm handled the incorporation of the Pepsi-Cola company. And apparently he had to put, as part of it, he had to put some money into Pepsi and got some stock back for that. It's unclear exactly what kind of transaction that was, but he came home and said to Ethel that he had just thrown some money away. And as it turns out, it was one of the most lucrative things the law firm ever did. And he ended up splitting the stock that he had left in Pepsi between his 4 daughters and Ethel, and it supported Ethel for the rest of her life. And in fact, my mother was extremely attached, emotionally attached to this Pepsi stock, and would never sell any of it, lived off it late in her life, and passed it down to her children. And just speaking, I only know about the Tuckers, the children of Marge, his oldest daughter. And a lot of us feel equally attached to it. And from what I understand, even some of his great-grandchildren have some Pepsi stock. So it certainly turned out to be a good thing. That brings us to the subject of Arthur's marriage. And of course, his cousin Dennis, his law partner, had a huge impact on who Arthur married. Arthur's cousin Dennis was married to a woman named Mary Brennan, and Mary had a niece named Ethel Brennan, and that is how Arthur met his future wife. When he first met her, Ethel was only 15 years old, because remember, Ethel was 12 years younger than Arthur. I may not have mentioned that before, but and then he met her again at Dennis and Mary's house at a dinner when she had first graduated from college, and that's when they began to court. However, as you can imagine, so Arthur and Dennis are actually cousins, but because Arthur married Dennis's niece, some people referred to him as his nephew, whereas Dennis is only his nephew. Arthur is only Dennis's nephew through marriage, not through blood. Through blood, they're cousins. But Dennis used to joke and introduce him to some business partners as his nephew, although he certainly wasn't. So Ethel knew Arthur for quite some time because she used to babysit for Uncle Denny's children. When she was 15 years old, his kids were 2 and 5 years old, and she babysat for him often, and remembered seeing Arthur on multiple occasions. However, she couldn't have possibly been from a more different background than Arthur was. So let's take a look at her family. As you can see, the top line are her 4 grandparents who all immigrated from Ireland. Most of them in the teen years. However, her grandmother Anne came over at 11, and we're not sure about about when some of them came over. But let's first talk about the Brennans on the left, which were her father's family. And the first thing that strikes you is just the number of aunts and uncles they had. She had grandparents and aunts and uncles because her family had immigrated a generation earlier. So Arthur, on the other hand, did not know his grandparents after he was 16 years old. And Arthur had one aunt, Aunt Nellie. And here, as you'll see, Ethel not only has a lot of family, but her family has a lot of resources. And not only that, but they spent a lot of time with her. So let's go through that. First of all, her uncle Michael Brennan, the one on the left, the top left, he came over as a teenager, and he actually worked on St. Patrick's when it was first being built. But he had a lot of business sense. He ended up building a lot of buildings. He had, as you can see, 7 children. He had 11 that were born and 7 that survived to adulthood. But he built so many successful projects that he ended up amassing quite a fortune and at one point put $900,000, so almost $1 million of his own money, and built the San Remo Hotel, which was a magnificent building overlooking Central Park. And it was the first apartment / hotel where people could actually live. And the Brennans lived in quite a luxurious house that was right next door to the hotel. And they had an elaborate lifestyle with live-in servants and so forth. And by the way, all her grandparents were completely uneducated, but they clearly were just smart people who took advantages of the opportunities of the growth in New York City at the time. So her other grandparents on the right, the Duffys, they were also immigrants. They had a total of 8 children, and 7 of them survived to adulthood. And Michael, again, the redundancy in names, both of her grandparents were named Michael. He started out as a mason, but ended up making a fortune buying, owning, renting, selling properties. He owned a farm on 58th Street, and at one point owned the property where Penn Station is now built. They also lived an elegant lifestyle on Central Park and had live-in help as well. And her grandmother Anne was a very, very close person and an influential person in Ethel's life. And she lived with her, as you'll see, for a number of years, but also she, even when she wasn't living with her, would go and see her and have lunch with her every Saturday, and they would often spend time together. Let's talk about her father. Her father apparently was quite a fun person, and is the one that she remembers taking her on outings, teaching her to swim as soon as she could walk, which was a lifelong passion of hers. However, he had a very difficult time keeping a job, and we'll discuss that a little further in a minute. But her aunts and uncles also spent a fair amount of time with her and really were influential in her life. Her Uncle Jack taught her how to play cribbage and poker and lots of different card games, and she ended up playing card games, loving card games for the rest of her life. That was kind of a lifelong passion of hers. 2 of her aunts, Aunt Margaret on the one side and Mary on the other, gave her tickets to go to the opera and to go see plays. And she said any Sunday she was available that they would take her out. And she said that they showed her a part of life that she never would have seen otherwise. And so she was grateful, very grateful for the time that she spent with them. Her Uncle Walter taught her how to skate and taught her how to play tennis. And tennis also ended up being a lifelong passion of hers. She played tennis throughout her life. And in fact, that's where she ended up meeting the man that she would ultimately have an affair with. And her Aunt Etta taught her how to play piano, and she said that was the one thing that did not stick. But Etta also was taken by her mother, Anne, to Europe almost every year to buy new clothes in Paris. And so she also always was extremely well dressed. And she would give her clothes from the prior year to Ethel. And so Ethel said her mother would rework the dresses to work for Ethel. And so as a result, Ethel felt that she was always extremely well dressed her whole life, which, as growing up, which she was very grateful for. So as you can see, it isn't just that she was had a lot of aunts and uncles. These aunts and uncles were spending really quality time with her and really cared about her. And another example is Thomas, who was president of a publishing company, and he took a real interest in her education. She described him as an intellectual. And so when it was time for her to go to college, he gave her the brochures on what he thought were the best women's colleges at the time and helped her choose a college. And then as well, when she graduated, he gave her a job in his publishing company, and she was only there for less than a year before marrying Arthur. But clearly this is yet another relative of hers who was taking an active interest in her life. And then there was her uncle Dennis, who was Arthur's law partner, and his wife Mary. And Ethel, I'm going to read now some of the things that Ethel said about, she called him Uncle Denny and Mary. She said, Uncle Denny and Aunt Mary used to invite me every summer for at least a month in their place. He and I were very good friends. The first time I rode in a car was with Uncle Denny. Prior to that, she would ride in a horse and carriage for groceries and such. She goes on to say, I babysat for their two little boys, Paul and Ken. They were 10 years younger than me. They were 4 and 5, and I was 15, and so we spent the whole summer together. I spent a great deal of my life with them. All my life, I was very close to Uncle Denny. I've been involved with the O'Brien family from the time I was a little girl. They had more influence on my life than anything. Aunt Mary was a wonderful one. She was the one who had opera tickets all the time and gave them to me. She was very exceptional. I was very at home with the O'Briens. So clearly a very special place in her heart. This is the house that the O'Briens lived in, where Mary used to visit them. It's in Yonkers, and this is a current day picture. It may have looked quite different at the time. I'm sure it had more property associated with it, but it's still a lovely home. And I'm going to read you something else that Ethel said. She said, my aunts and uncles were so good to me. She said, I always thought I was terribly lucky, and I still think so, because even my sisters didn't have all these things I had. Going to the opera, going to the theater, all these things my aunts and uncles did for me. I could never understand why, but I was just lucky, and it didn't work for them. I got spoiled rotten. I think it's pretty clear that there must have been something about Ethel that made her aunts and uncles and her grandparents want to take such an active part in her life. So clearly she had something to offer, either in potential or that she was just fun and charming or whatever. But she had a very robust family life. And as you can see, this is quite different, both in terms of the resources and just the number of adults active in her life than Arthur's experience was. So now we're going to talk about Ethel's family of origin, which is quite a different story than her extended family. So outside the dark box, you can see her 4 grandparents at the top. But her immediate family was a little bit of a train wreck. Her father, she believed in later life, could have been an alcoholic, although she didn't know it at the time. But she said that there was a lot of fighting in the household, and it was a very unhappy house. She said that at one point in time, they actually had a fight where her father threw something through a glass door and broke it. And at that point, she was sent to live with her grandmother, Anne Duffy, and her grandfather, Michael Duffy. And she actually lived there for most of her grade school, elementary school years. In addition to that, her older sister, Ruth, had been sent away to live in a convent for 8 years. So Ethel said she never felt that she knew her sister Ruth very well because she just wasn't in the same household with her for most of the time. So her mother, Nellie, said that she would have left her husband, Mark, except that there would have been no way for her to support herself. And as it was, Mark had actually many jobs, including several that his father Michael gave him. But Mark was never able to hold a job for more than a short time. And so his parents and his in-laws supported the family, but they gave the checks directly to Ethel's mother, Nellie. They never gave the money to Mark. And in fact, when Margaret and Michael died, they did not leave anything to Ethel's father, Mark, because they felt that they had given him so much money during his lifetime that there was no reason to give him further money. And apparently that was quite painful for him to hear. Ethel said, "My grandfather took care of us, and he gave my mother a check every month to keep us. We went away every summer, and I didn't find out until just a few years ago that my other grandmother paid for our summer every summer. They just simply took care of us. It was very generous of them." When Ethel met Arthur again, right after graduating from college, she was in love with her college sweetheart named George. But George had gone off to participate in World War I, and he wasn't there, and she began dating Arthur. So this is what Ethel had to say. "Uncle Denny was the most wonderful man in the world. Since Arthur was his cousin, I thought Arthur would be just like him. We didn't date very long because he expected to be drafted any minute and he was anxious to get married. My mother thought Arthur was the be-all and end-all, that he was the most wonderful person. He was rich because he was already a partner in a law firm, and he was a man where, as she thought, George was a little boy. She told me not to marry George, that little boy." And then she went on to say, "In those days, you won't believe it, but you didn't do it when your parents disapproved of it. Nowadays, you just do it and say, we're getting married and that's it. But it was different in those days. You didn't fight your family." And so they were married. You can imagine why Ethel's mother wanted her to marry Arthur, since Ethel's mother had been married to a man who couldn't hold a job and never was able to provide for his family. She probably looked at Arthur and thought that he would provide a lot of security to Ethel, and that she was helping to make a decision that would bring her daughter a good life. So that's easy to understand. However, the two had nothing in common. As you saw, most of the things that Ethel had learned from her family were leisure activities, cards and swimming and tennis and so forth. And Arthur had just worked really hard his whole life. And she was a new college graduate. He was 12 years old, a partner in a law firm. He had no grandparents in her life, and both of her grandparents were millionaires in the terms of those days, as well as in terms of today. But even in their own day, they actually had $1 million. So they had very, very little in common. So for the wedding, she said, this is what she says: "I didn't even have a veil until a neighbor decided I better have one. We just had the Lawlers and O'Briens in the vestibule of our house in Yonkers where we lived, and a bottle of champagne. That was the first time I had anything to drink." And you may remember those two couples that she had at the wedding. The Lawlers was her aunt and uncle, who the man who helped her pick out of college and gave her a job after she graduated. And the O'Briens, of course, were Arthur's cousin and law partner and her favorite uncle. This picture is one of Arthur and Ethel in the front, and doesn't really have anything to do with what I've been talking about, except that it's one of the few pictures we have of them together, and it was probably well after they got married. We don't know who the people in the back are. And this picture is a 4-generation picture. The babies are, on the right is Marjorie, Ethel and Arthur's oldest daughter, my mother. And the other baby is Aunt E, so their second daughter. Ethel is between the two of them. And the grandmother, her mother, is standing, and they always had a lot of conflict between them because Ethel was always bitter that she was sent away from home for so long in her childhood. And then sitting on the couch next to Ethel is her favorite grandmother, Anne, who she lived with through most of her years. And so what Ethel said about her life at that time was, she said, Arthur told me very definitively, your job is to raise children and run the house. It's my job to bring in the money. And she says about after having 3 children in 3 years, she said, I thought I was losing my mind. I was so distraught about the whole thing, and I knew I had to do something. So I didn't know anything else to do except practice birth control. It's very hard when you can't talk to your spouse. Ethel said, I don't want to have a baby every year with a man I don't love. So I think it's pretty remarkable that we know that she used birth control. Somebody 100 years ago, this is literally 100 years ago, a little more, and she said that she started using a diaphragm and that she felt so guilty about it that she went to her priest and confessed it because it was so against the Catholic Church's teaching. But as she said, she felt she was losing her mind. Let's talk about a happier subject now, which is the house that Ethel and Arthur raised their girls in. We're going to talk about it partly because it's just a spectacular house, but also because my cousins and I, my siblings and I all heard a lot about this house growing up. Most people are attached to the house that they grew up in, and that was definitely true of the Driscoll girls. This is the Zillow listing of what the house looks like today. When they bought the house, it was on 6 acres. Now it's listed as being just 1.5 acres. And the 8 bedrooms that you see there, 4 of the bedrooms on the second floor were used by the family, and then 4 bedrooms downstairs were used by live-in servants. And there were also 4 garages, 2 attached and 2 in a separate building that had an apartment above it that the gardener and his family lived in. And there was a greenhouse next to it as well. This is what the house on Morris Lane looked like at the time that Ethel and Arthur were raising their 4 daughters there. They originally bought it for $125,000. And although it originally had 6 acres, they sold right away 2 of the acres, which had a garden and a tennis court on it. This is a picture of Aunt E, Arthur's second oldest daughter. And I have a picture of her because I'm going to read a number of different things that she said about that house. And remember, she said these things, when she was in her early 90s. She said, when we were very young, we had 5 live-in servants. I didn't see my parents much because we had a nurse and a governess. We always had a cook. Mother never went in the kitchen. We always had Moses. And just as an aside, Ethel said, this is not the daughter Ethel, but Arthur's wife Ethel said that most of their servants were immigrants from Europe, that often their first job when they came into the country would be living in somebody's house and helping out. That was a fairly common thing. So most of the servants, 4 of them, would tend to come and go and would be young women. But they had a black man named Moses who was just about like part of the family. My mother said that he was the only adult in her life who told her how to behave. And he had a very, very central role and stayed with them always. In fact, even when Arthur was fairly elderly and lived alone, Moses stayed with him. So Ethel goes on to say, we always had Moses, and we would have an upstairs maid. Oh, and then we had a laundress. My bed was turned back every night. Clean laundry was always in the drawers. I thought everyone lived like that. We had one of those phones in the kitchen and the pantry. I think she means where you could call other parts of the house. Later on, she said, I ate with my sisters in the maid's dining room until I was 13. There were no adults who ate with us. The staff ate later. Then we went to boarding school when we were 13 or 14, and that's what all 4 girls did. Later on, she said, our meals were served. She said, in fact, we had finger bowls every night. When we had guests, they didn't know what to do with them. And at another point, she said, Moses drove us places. He taught me to drive at 13. Do you know, I still dream about that house. I'd love to see what they've done with it. It just opened up beautifully. It was a wonderful house. I think about what they might have done with it and what I would do with it if I was living there now. It had great possibilities. Of course, it had a lot of wasted space. It had a huge butler's pantry, probably half the size of this living room. And that's where the cupboards were, and Moses' sink. And then off of that, a huge working kitchen and a table in the middle. And off of that, a little room where we would eat. And also had a washer and dryer in it. And that had a door to the outside, and the kitchen had a door to the outside because people still delivered milk in bottles, and the cook would phone in for groceries. They would deliver groceries and they would come in through that door. And then there were the back stairs into the kitchen, into the maid's wing, which had 3 bedrooms and a bath. And then Moses' room was above the garage. I never went up there. It had a bedroom and a bath. So there were parts of the house that the kids had never even been in. This is just a picture of the 3 girls, the 3 oldest girls, Marjorie, Ethel, and Kay, when they were young. Just, I'm showing it because she was talking about how they grew up in this house. So Ethel went on to say, as we got older, the number of servants who lived with us decreased. The laundress became a day worker, and she would come in, I don't know how many days, and do laundry. We always had a cook. Then at the end, we had just 2. We always had at least 2, even during the war years. Oh, and then the gardener lived in the gardener's cottage with his family, and his wife did the mending. This is an article that I found on the internet that had been printed in a local paper at the time that they were living there. And I'm going to read it to you. Marjorie Driscoll is reported improving. Marjorie Driscoll, 11-year-old daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Driscoll of Morris Lane, was injured on Wednesday afternoon of last week when an auto driven by her father's chauffeur collided with another car in White Plains and crashed into the show window of a grocery store. Marjorie, who received contusions and abrasions of the nose, is reported as greatly improved. Well, we never heard about this crash, but the point I wanted to make is it's not really a chauffeur. He didn't have a chauffeur. That was Moses. And of course, she wasn't driving in a car when she was 11 years old with her parents. Moses was the one who really took on a lot of the role of a parent and drove the girls places and was the one who was participating in their life on a day-to-day basis. And by the way, when I gave this presentation to all of my cousins, one of them, actually Hillary, Budge's wife, said that when Ethel, Aunt E, the second daughter of Arthur and Ethel, when she was on her deathbed, she said, Moses has come to get me. As the last little bit before we move on to another topic, Mary, when she interviewed Ethel when she was 89 years old, she asked her if they had many parties at the house. And Ethel's answer was, yes, the house was marvelous for entertaining. It had this big, lovely living room, and then lovely library and a beautiful porch and a great big pantry. Everything was geared for entertaining. And I had all these servants. I would just tell Moses, we'll have 20 people for dinner Saturday night. This is the menu, and it would happen. And the biggest event that they had, apparently, was my parents' wedding. So this is Marjorie and Tom, my parents, and this is, of course, their oldest daughter. And here is Ethel, their second oldest daughter, and Kay, their third, and Susan, the youngest, behind Ethel. And what Ethel said about it was that she said it happened just a few months after World War II started. So they sent out 500 invitations and only 6 people said no, because she said it was the wartime and nobody was having any fun. So everyone was thrilled to be invited to something. And she said they put the altar in the living room, and they apparently had a smaller ceremony, and then they entertained everyone outdoors. They set up the tables outdoors, and fortunately there was fabulous weather. And they had all of the maids and servants and butlers of their friends catered the party for them. But it just goes to show the kind of entertaining that they could take on with this kind of a property. Now let's talk about their life outside of the family and his career. And I've called it a glamorous life, which is my word, not theirs, but I think you'll agree there are a lot of pretty glamorous elements to it. And one of the things that Aunt E said was, he said, Dad was just brilliant. She said he was in the newspaper all the time. There were very few attorneys then. He had distinguished clients. That was fun. So they went to, because his clients were all in the entertainment industry, they went to a lot of premieres and opening nights. They'd go backstage and talk to the entertainers. And they just were invited to a lot of parties and just seemed to be having a lot of fun. One of his favorite clients was Jack Dempsey, who was the heavyweight champion of the world at the time. And one anecdote that Ethel gave was that one time she and Arthur went on a train to see one of his fights in Chicago. And on the train on the way back, Arthur was acting quite nervous and fidgety, and he told her he had $200,000 in his jacket pocket. And she said that Jack had given him his earnings for the night, and Arthur took care of a lot of his money. And she said that because Arthur took care of him, Jack lived well his entire life, whereas a lot of people who were athletes at the time, and certainly it even happens today, would run out of money as soon as they stopped working. And but they had such a close working relationship that Jack would just turn his money over to Arthur. That $200,000 is the equivalent of $3.5 million in 2025. So huge amount of money. Jack was one of his favorite clients, and these are examples. Arthur didn't usually do divorces, but when Jack got divorced, he did handle it because he was such a good friend and client. And these are two pictures that were in the newspaper just to show that his clients were so high profile that they often made the newspaper. And one where he's in his uniform there, Arthur was walking to trial with him, and his daughter, Kathleen, who we call Kay, was with him, and she was 20 years old at the time. So the family just got to do a lot of fun things with him. And this is Arthur with, so this is Arthur, and this is his cousin, Dennis O'Brien, and this is Jack Dempsey when he was quite a bit older. But they remained friends their entire lives. But the newspaper article there is something that was written when he visited us in Austin once. I think he only came one time. He was interviewed by the local paper, and they printed up an article on him. And this was one paragraph that he wrote about Jack Dempsey. So I'm going to read it to you. He said, but thinking back over his career, he readily names Jack Dempsey as the client whose friendship he most values. Jack was and is a great man, says his longtime attorney. He has a warm heart, a great kindness and consideration for others, and a high set of principles. I've enjoyed a friendship with many big celebrities, but I don't think any have been more rewarding than my friendship with Jack. And one of the things I think that tells you is what he values in people. And Arthur was a man of very high integrity and personal principles, and he appreciated that in his friends as well. These two articles appeared when Arthur was elected mayor of Scarsdale. it was surprising that he was elected because it was a Republican area and he was the first Democrat ever to be elected. Ethel said she was surprised, but that what she heard was that Arthur had a reputation for being honest and hardworking, and that's why he was able to win in spite of his party affiliation. And as you can see, the article on the right is from North Brookfield, his hometown, where his family of origin still lived. And he was active in many, many organizations. This particular picture is from the Scarsdale Golf Club, and you can see him in the front by the round table. He's at the podium speaking. His daughter, Ethel, Aunt E, said that Dad was involved in everything. He was president of the golf club, president of town hall, president of the tennis club, even though we had our own tennis courts, president of the Catholic club. He was involved in zoning. Late in life, he said, if I had it to do over again, I would have spent more time with my family. This picture is from when ex-president, or former president, I should say, Herbert Hoover, was visiting Scarsdale. Since Arthur was the mayor, he invited him to come to dinner at his home. And this is the picture of the two of them in front of his house on Morris Lane that we saw earlier. And that was quite exciting, Ethel said, to have the ex-president, the former president, to their home for dinner. And this next picture is a letter that I found in the files that Aunt Susan had. And it was from Arthur to his friend George Corcoran, the one that he lived with for 7 years in college. And he says, I'm sending to you herewith a check from blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the first paragraph is just saying he's sending him a check. And then he comments, I'm going to the World Series this afternoon with George M. Cohan, and I hope to see another game tomorrow. So this is just an example of the glamorous life. He was going to the World Series with the world's most premier entertainer. And I looked up what the World Series was in 1936, and it was called the Subway Series because it was the New York Yankees and the New York Giants. It wasn't for over 20 years later that the New York Giants moved to San Francisco and became the San Francisco Giants, which are my home team. But it was just another example of the fun things that he got to do because of the high-profile people that he knew. This is a picture of Ethel and Arthur with their best friends, the Hogates. Arthur and Ethel are in the middle, Ethel looking quite elegant in her fur collar and cuffs and her hat. And the Hogates are Kenneth and Anne Hogate, who lived less than a mile from them. And in addition to the couples being really close, the Hogates' oldest two daughters were very close friends with Arthur and Ethel's oldest two girls, Marjorie and Ethel. I had heard the Hogates' name my entire life because my mother was lifelong friends with their oldest daughter, and Aunt E likewise was visited and wrote to their second oldest daughter her entire life. And I didn't know until I was preparing for this presentation and re-listening to the interview with Aunt E. She made the comment that, well, Kenneth Hogate was higher profile than her father, Arthur. And I said, well, who the heck is he? And I looked him up, and he was the CEO and president of the Wall Street Journal, the chairman of the board of Dow Jones, and he was the mayor of Scarsdale after Arthur was. So not only did he have very high-profile people in his work life, but his best friend was one of the leading editors in the country. And he died on vacation when he was only 49 years old, so extremely young and at the height of the time that he and Arthur were friends. And Aunt E told me that Arthur delivered the eulogy at his memorial service, and that she said it was an amazing eulogy and said a lot about their friendship and about both Kenneth and about Arthur. And she said, be sure I give it to you before you leave. And I've been kicking myself ever since because I didn't get it, and no one has it at this point. And now for the least fun topic of all, which is the separation of Arthur and Ethel. So many of us have big years in our life, but I haven't heard of many that match 12-month period in 1941 and 42. In many ways, they were riding high. Arthur was mayor of the town. He argued in front of the Supreme Court that year. They had former President Hoover over to their house for dinner. And on the world stage, it was in the other direction. Pearl Harbor happened. And as a result of Pearl Harbor, 3 of their 4 daughters hurriedly, with very little time for preparation, married their long-term boyfriends. This is a picture of my parents' wedding that we talked about before at their house. And all 3 men went off to support the war effort. My father went overseas and actually fought in the war. And in addition to that, Arthur learned that Ethel had been having an affair, and they separated. And during the time of this wedding at their house, Ethel had already moved out of the house a few months before. So she said it was extremely awkward preparing the wedding and giving it, since they had just newly been separated, and it was quite uncomfortable. So these are some things that Ethel said about it. I'm going to read a number of things. Oh, and by the way, my mother always said that all of them hated this picture. And the reason is because she said you could see the line of their girdles. See this horizontal line? Women wore girdles in those days to hold up their stockings. And so that they didn't like the fact that it showed. And as you can probably see, none of those women needed to wear girdles. Okay, so this is what Ethel had to say. She said, "We never talked about anything. We couldn't communicate." And then at another point in time, she said, remember this interview was over multiple days, and she said these things at different times. She said, "I never wanted to fight with anyone because we had too much fighting in my home growing up. I was afraid, so we never fought. He would just sulk, and that would be the end of it. We never could talk things out." And remember, in those days, there were no resources. Nobody had therapists. There weren't self-help books. There weren't the words even to deal with problems in a relationship. Then she went on to say, "Arthur had never had any experience with women, unfortunately. He hadn't been with a woman before we were married. Our sex life was just a disaster. It was very bad because he had worked so hard all his life that he didn't know how to break off or anything like that." And yet a second time, in a completely different day, she said, "Our sex life was a disaster. I thought I was raped every time we had sex. And I was certainly not a good partner for poor Arthur, who had never had any experience before. I think he got a raw deal." So you might question why I'm including that information in here. And the reason is that she said this when she was 89 years old. She'd been separated from Arthur for 45 years. And this is what she chose to say about her life to her 29-year-old granddaughter and 32-year-old granddaughter. So this was clearly a major, major part of her life. And Ethel, at one point during the interview, said, "We had a paddle tennis court. I've always played a lot of tennis, and when Arthur had some kind of a nervous breakdown of some kind, I had a paddle tennis court built." And Mary says, "Nervous breakdown?" And she said, "Well, I think it was because I was an unsatisfactory wife of some kind. But anyway, he got sick and went out to Arizona for a couple of months to get better. And I didn't know then that I think it was because we were unhappily married. As I look back, I think that's probably it. So this is all we know about this. And the part about he had a nervous breakdown and they had a paddle tennis court built is a pretty big non sequitur. But I put this in here because this is all we know about this topic. But it certainly shows if he left his life and went out for 2 months to live in another state, that there was something pretty major going on with him and how he felt about his life. And we don't know exactly at what point that was, but it's clear there was a lack of compatibility between the two at the very least. So they did not get divorced because they said because they were Catholics and didn't believe in divorce. And so they separated and neither one of them married again. And she said, he never talked to me about his cases. We never talked about anything. We couldn't communicate. I only know that he was a hardworking, sweet, lovely person and he got a raw deal. So she was very respectful of him up until the end. This was when she was 89 years old, and she's saying that he's a sweet, lovely person, and he got a wrong deal. So she clearly blames herself as much as she blames him, and it just seemed like it was a bad match from the beginning. This is my favorite part of the material we're covering today, and it's my favorite because it's the part that I experienced personally the most myself. During the Depression, the height of the major depression, Arthur bought a second home, which he called the camp. He was 48 years old at the time. Ethel was 36, and their daughters were from 6 to 14 years old. It's located on the border between Massachusetts and Connecticut in this dip right here. And my cousin tells me that the reason the dip is there is so that Massachusetts could include the lake as part of its territory. So his longtime friend, George Corcoran, who he had lived with for 7 years in college, and they remained very close friends, bought this property up here. And he was encouraging Arthur to buy a property as well. And then this one that he did ultimately buy came on the market. So I'm going to read to you one of the first letters that we have, which is George telling Arthur about the property and encouraging him to purchase it. I received your letter and I'm very glad you had such a pleasant trip. No doubt you will feel a lot better after you rest. You did not mention the pain in your head. I trust that no news is good news concerning it. So first of all, this shows how well they know each other, that he knows he just took a trip. He knows he wasn't feeling well. They talk to each other a lot. These guys had a very close relationship their whole life. And he goes on to say, I called Dr. Van Allen, who is the owner of the house he ultimately buys, Dr. Van Allen last night, and talked to him about the Adams place. Oh, excuse me. The Adams place is the one he bought. Dr. Van Allen was just a person who knew a lot about real estate. So Van is quite keen in the real estate business and has bought and sold at the lake, so knows property there. He said that he would not doubt, but that the place had been worth $5,500, meaning before the Depression, and that if you could buy it between $4,000 and $4,500, it would be a very good buy. Our place stands us at about $4,500 or more, so that I feel his estimate is about right. In view of existing conditions, meaning the recession, or depression, I should say, and the fact that he wants to sell it, will be interesting to get a price from him first. Then he goes on to say, it so happens that I have some liquid money in the bank, and I would be very happy to take the first mortgage for you. I would consider it a good investment. Well, that kind of blows my mind because, first of all, it shows how much he was eager to have Arthur come and spend time at the lake with him and his family. And it also shows an unusual level of closeness because, I mean, these days you just can't imagine somebody making that offer to somebody else outside their family. And I doubt that things were any different at that point in time. So it really speaks to their relationship. He goes on to say, I would be very glad to go over to talk to Adams if you wish. I might be able to do something with him. I presume you and Ethel can give us a lot of pointers on contract, which he capitalizes. I think he's talking about contract bridge, after your lectures on the boat. Well, we hope to continue our games at the lake. Let me know if there's anything you wish me to do about the property. Give my love to Ethel and the children. The next letter regarding the purchase of the camp at Lake Congamon is from Arthur to the owner of the house. And he simply says, I received your recent letter. I will pay you $3,000 for the property at Congamon, subject, of course, to the title being clear and unencumbered. So this is the total of his offer. It's one sentence. And you notice there are no professionals involved, no real estate agent, no closing company, a title company. There is an attorney representing them. That's it. It's pretty straightforward. And then the next one is from George Adams. So it's so confusing having both the people he's communicating with be George. So this is the owner of the house. And the entire purpose of this letter is simply to set up a meeting. So he says, this will acknowledge your letter of February 14th. So he got his offer. I expect to be in New York on business Friday, March 2nd, and if convenient to you, I will call on you Saturday morning, March 3rd, about 10 o'clock, at which time I can sit down with you and go into the matter definitively. If I do not hear the contract, I will be there as above stated. So this entire letter was only for the purpose of setting up a meeting. And if you think about what this went through, so he would have dictated this to his secretary because his secretary's initials were on it. And so somebody typed it up, put the letter in an envelope, put a stamp on it, put it in the mail. It was carried, hand carried, all the way from Massachusetts to New York. And the only purpose was to set up a meeting. It just looks so complicated compared to today. And then the last letter is from Arthur to his friend George. And he says, on Saturday, George Adams called to see me, and I signed a contract to buy his cottage at Congamon for $3,500, significantly below what they said it was worth. So Arthur did a good job negotiating. I paid him $500 cash and agreed to pay the balance in 30 days, provided I found the title to be all right. He suggested that after I search the title, if I will send a check to you, meaning his friend that he's known for so long, so send the check to him and he will see to it that a deed is delivered to you and you can exchange one for the other. So in other words, he's doing the job that today a title company would do. But instead of having a professional, it's just a person that both the buyer and the seller mutually know, and he's going to get the deed and the check and exchange one for the other. So the whole thing is so devoid of professionals. He said, however, I'm getting in touch with a law firm in Hartford, Connecticut, and asking them to take a look at the title. I presume it will be found to be all right. I have a notion that I've actually secured a bargain, however, time will tell. Why don't you and Seal, that's George's wife, come down for the weekend or a week if you can do it. This is a time of year when a couple of days off would do you good. The sooner, the better. So they're anxious to see each other. Anyway, all quite remarkable and very different than the way things are done today. This is a picture of the lake house that Arthur bought and that was in the family for so many years. We're looking at the side and the back of it. And as you can see on the bottom, it was screened in on this whole side and then on the front side that faced the lake as well. And you can also see upstairs on the left the screened-in porch, which was one of the things that everyone was especially fond of. It was just a wood frame house with no insulation. It was not winterized. In this view, you see the pump house in the foreground, which is that triangle-shaped building. Well, you can't tell from this side, but the small one with the door on it. And here you see it from the front. This is the part that's facing the lake. And again, on the upper right, you can see the screened-in porch, sleeping porch where all of us slept, multiple generations. When my generation slept there, Arthur slept in the first bed, farthest away from the lakeside, and then his grandchildren slept on the other beds. And the downstairs facing the lake, as you can see, is all screened in as well. My parents were the last ones in our family to own this property, and when their children all first left home and were no longer going regularly to the lake house, they sold it, and it was shortly after it was torn down. And apparently Aunt Susan cried when she heard that the lake house was gone, because she was 6 years old when her father bought it, and she had been going there her entire life, as did most of Arthur's grandchildren. I think it's fair to say that all of my cousins feel disappointed that we let this house go out of the family. We're all very nostalgic about it. And my family, my immediate family, all my siblings, we spent every single summer of the entire summer of our childhood going to this lake house. So we feel especially nostalgic about it. Arthur always called the lake house the camp. And in fact, when they first bought it, it wasn't very different than camping out. There were no indoor toilets. In fact, there was an outhouse attached to the garage that had 2 seats, and there was no divider between the 2 seats, which always made us wonder how that worked. But they immediately added indoor toilets, so that's one luxury they had. 8 years after they bought it, World War II started, and then there was a quota on the amount of gasoline civilians could use, and so there wasn't enough gasoline to go out, and they basically didn't go for a couple of years. But once World War II was over, in 1947, they added hot water and a bathtub, which were 2 huge luxuries that hadn't been there. Prior to that, people had been washing off in the lake. And they had an ice box where ice was regularly delivered, and they called it the refrigerator. When they first got it, 16 years after they moved in, they called it the electric icebox from what I can tell about the first 10 years they had it. And they didn't have garbage collection for the first 20 years. They had to burn their garbage. They burned it in a metal barrel. And it wasn't until 24 years after they bought it that they had a motorbike. But most of my memory was of them having all of those things. So it always seemed fabulous to me. But the early days must have been a little more like camping out. The boys in the picture from left to right are Budge Mallory, Petey Mallory, Jimmy Johnson. Those are my 3 cousins, and then my brother, Jeff Tucker. This is one of the earliest pictures of me and my cousins, so my generation at the lake. I'm the curly-haired one in front, and the rest are all my cousins, my parents and my aunts and uncles. And my parents' generation, as you can see, dressed up quite a bit to go to the lake, whereas not very many years after that, everybody was extremely casual at the lake, and that has never changed. This is a picture of Arthur surrounded by some of his grandchildren. I'm the one on the far right. And it was taken behind the lake house in front of the paddle tennis court. In 1958, Kay Johnson, Arthur's third daughter, and her family bought a property several lots down from Arthur's house. And through the Johnsons, we met the Montouris, who are another big Catholic family who had a house in between the two. So I spent my youth with my cousins walking between all of these houses, either on a path that's on the lakeside of the houses or on that road behind it. That was our hood. In 1968, when my parents, and of course my mother was Arthur's oldest daughter, they owned the house. They split the property that the house was on, and Arthur's youngest daughter, Susan, and her family built a house on that piece of the property that was separated out. In that same year, the Johnsons bought a second house, which is behind the Montouris' house there. And so you can see it was quite a community of Driscolls and friends. And to this day, all of those houses are owned by the same people listed here, with the exception of the Tuckers, which was Arthur's original house. All the others are still owned by the people who bought it in 1968, and 4 of my cousins live full-time at Lake Congamon today. This is a picture of Arthur and his friend George, the friends from college who lived together for 7 years in college, and they're sitting side by side watching a paddle tennis game. And that's the lake you can see in the background, the lake house. Here they are, after all these years, still enjoying each other's company. Right over Arthur's head, you can see his sister Jane, who is his only other sibling who was able to go to high school. And she was the one who was a seamstress all of her life. And all the way on the right is one of George's children, and then the daughters, and the children are all his grandchildren. On this picture is George and Arthur when they were in their 20s, and on the right, they were both 76 years old. So the relationship was really one of the most important relationships of both of their lives. Arthur had a total of 21 grandchildren, and we are all, I'm speaking as one of them, extremely close compared to any other family I know, because we all spent these summers as basically free-range kids at Arthur's house and the other houses that his daughters subsequently bought. So it was really very idyllic times in our mind, and as a result, we've stayed close as adults, and we still see each other regularly. And by the way, this information, the reason that I'm doing this now is because these cousins are the last people who had personal relationships with Arthur, who knew him personally. And so this is really aimed at the children of Arthur's grandchildren. And that's why I've put here trying to explain that Arthur would be your great-grandfather and so forth. Because the cousins knew each other so well, when the oldest of the cousins were in our 30s, we decided to start having reunions. And the first one was in 1987, and it was held at Lake Congamon. This is a picture of Joe Farr. You can see the motorboat off to the right. We always had motorboats at Lake Congamon. And Joe is holding his daughter Adrian, who would be one of Arthur's and Ethel's great-grandchildren. There were a pack of his great-grandchildren at the reunion. Here are some of them. And here are some others, including my son, sitting on the very dock where we swam and boated from during our whole childhood. And this is a picture of the entire group who was at that first family reunion. And in the middle, you can see the four sisters who were all still with us at that time. And now the oldest of the cousins are about the same age as the four sisters were in this picture. We've continued to have reunions every 2 to 3 years of all the cousins and our families. We long ago outgrew Lake Congamon, and we now go to State Park, usually Pipestem State Park in West Virginia. And although we had a reunion just a few months ago, we failed to get a cousin's picture at that one. But this is the picture from 2022, 3 years ago. And of course, all 21 cousins were there. So I'm going to name them for you from left to right. In the back is Mo Mallory and his brother Petey. Next to him, my brother Jeff, my sister Peggy, my cousin Jimmy Johnson, Stephen Johnson, David Martin, Mark Johnson, Budge Mallory, Phil Mallory, and on the end there is Brian. And then starting back on the left again in the front is me, Nancy, and then Amy, Dale Johnson, I've already named Peggy, Leah McKern, Sarah Farr, Mary Tucker, Janice, Kathleen, Ellen, and Carol. We'll end with a few additional pieces of the story. Looking back again at Arthur's family of origin, so it's his parents on top, and he's all the way to the right because he's the youngest. And we talked about the advantages of him being the youngest in terms of him being able to get an education and being able to have a professional career as opposed to working in the boot factory. In addition to that, he had 4 children. Only one of his other siblings even got married, and only one had a child. So the fact that Arthur was the youngest and had all this freedom in his life allowed him to build quite a robust life compared to that of his siblings. So he was very fortunate in that respect. This tidbit is a bit obtuse, but stick with me. And it doesn't matter what the numbers are. Hopefully you'll get the sentiment of it. And I think that this really possibly speaks to why Arthur wanted to be the head of so many of the organizations that he was a part of. And I'll explain how I'm trying to make that connection here. But first of all, so he refers to this as a circular that he got, which is like a flyer that he got in the mail. So he had just bought the property at the lake and hadn't moved in yet, and he gets his circular. The property's in Massachusetts, so he gets it. This is from Springfield, Massachusetts. He has nothing to do with Springfield, Massachusetts, but he actually reads it, and not only does he read it, but he writes a letter back to the guy when he just has a strong response to it, and it isn't even clear why he would care enough to do that, but I think it says a lot about him. So let me read this to you. He says, I was very much interested in your circular in regard to the bond issue of the town of Springfield, which you sold on April 13th. For a town of its size to be able to put out a $93,000 bond issue at better than par speaks very well for the management of the town. I have been interested in town financing as I served on the board in Scarsdale, where I live. It is the experience of most towns that the public debt is constantly moving higher and higher, and the burden of carrying it is growing greater and greater. I note, however, that in your case, whereas in 1925 the interest on the bonded debt was nearly $88,000, in 1933 it was a little over $49,000. It is indeed a splendid showing. We are looking forward to getting to the lake, and I know we are going to enjoy it. So he takes the time to write to this guy because he's basically telling him he's doing a good job. And what occurred to me was he came from this family where the family's own finances weren't secure. They had to put all their kids to work early. They were just a struggling immigrant family. And so it seems that he's genuinely interested in the finance of organizations. And I think it's a possibility that the reason he became president of so many organizations is that he was genuinely interested in the health of whatever organization he was a part of and wanted to help to make them financially healthy. It just seems as though he likes numbers. He likes to know that an organization is financially sound, and it makes him so pleased when he sees that. He's willing to write to some guy who has nothing to do with him and to take the time to do that. Arthur wasn't a particularly talkative man, but it seems that sometimes he put his compliments in letters, just the way he did with the town secretary and treasurer that we just read that story about. And Ethel said, at one point he wrote me a letter and said he was very proud of what I had done bringing up the girls. I saved the letter. He was not apt to talk about anything like that. So it seems that although he wasn't very verbal, that he often had strong feelings about how people were doing. And his daughter, Aunt E, said, he was a good man. He did work for widows pro bono. He took care of all of his family, and by that she means his family's origin as well. So he often sent money and helped support his parents and his siblings. She goes on to say, Mother even admitted that our father was a wonderful man. So Ethel, after they separated, she was in her mid-40s when they separated, and it was a struggle for her, and she descended into pretty severe alcoholism, but she overcame it. In her 60s, she became sober, and this is a picture after she was sober. She was visiting in Austin. These are my sisters, Mary and Sarah. And not only did she overcome it, but she spent the rest of her life, as long as she could, helping others overcome substance abuse, alcoholism in particular. And this was a time that she was in the paper for having given 1,000 hours of volunteer time for this particular organization. She was 75 years old at the time, and she was willing to take phone calls at 2:00 in the morning if someone was facing temptation, even get out of bed and go help somebody if they were facing a particular time. So she really redeemed herself and led a very productive life. This is a picture of Arthur with his father. His father is the one who immigrated to the United States as a teenager and was illiterate till he was 35 years old. And his son, who argued in front of the Supreme Court 9 times. It's a pretty nice American story of how you can come to this country with nothing and in one generation do quite well for yourself. Ethel said about Arthur's father, Arthur had a darling father. He was just a sweet old gentleman. He doesn't look that sweet in this picture, but I feel quite sure that he was. So Arthur, just as his cousin Dennis had influenced so much in his life, his education, his career, his choice in a spouse, it happened in death too. That when Dennis bought a cemetery plot for his family, Arthur chose the plot right next to it and purchased that. So although they died several years apart, Arthur and his cousin Dennis are buried next to each other. which is nice symmetry because you may remember his father in this picture was buried right next to, under the same headstone as Dennis's mother, who came over as a teenager with Arthur's father. That's really sweet symmetry, I think. And although Arthur and Ethel died a number of years apart, Arthur died when he was 83 and Ethel lived to 97. Neither one of them ever married again. And when someone asked Ethel why, she said, "I didn't respect anyone else in the way I respected Arthur." So even though they were not compatible at all as a couple, she respected him till the end. And in fact, they were buried under the same headstone.